Hello, Brent. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start right out of the bat with a question that a lot of podcasters, I guess, ponder on, which is, what is the ideal length of an episode? How can you find what's the ideal length for your show, for the episodes of your own podcast?
Yeah, that is the great question, and I'm going to say it's not the same for everybody. It depends on your content and what you're doing, but there's too long, and then there's probably too short because you can't get enough in it. What I found is when I tell a listener, "Hey, let's target." In the very beginning, I said, let's record an hour, and I think my first show went like an hour and 15 minutes. People are inherently talkers. The people that want to be on a show are inherently talkers. And so they want to get across whatever message they want to get across. And oftentimes the better talkers take longer to get their message across because they really want to talk about their message, right? So if you're targeting 20 minutes, I would tell your listeners, I want to target 15 minutes. And I do think 20 minutes is a great time frame for an episode. It gets people in and out and allows them to try to get, you as a guest can get your topic out hopefully in 20 minutes unless you're a robust talker.
Right.
I would say that I've become a better listener than talker. And I like to see that data that says I talked 20 minutes and my guest talked 80. I talked 20% and my guest talked 80%.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, also for the guest, right? You don't want to be in a show and then being a guest in the show and then you just don't get to talk and you're just there. So you started with 1 hour roughly in your own episodes. And you said, and we were talking a little bit about this before, that you have been experimenting. Were you able to reduce that? What is the current size or in terms of minutes of your normal show?
Yeah, I'm guessing average about 30 minutes per episode. And I will say too, like if it's a very specific topic, like I started in the Magento space. Magento's an e-commerce platform, and we talked specifically about Magento. And that very small group of people that wanted to listen to Magento talk would listen, and they would listen for an hour.
Right.
But as you grow, as your audience gets larger, you need to be more cognitive of how much time they have to listen. And then I think that time becomes less and less. The amount of attention that they'll give to your podcast.
Yeah. Did you see any difference from engagement in the metrics when you moved from 1 hour to like 30 minutes?
I think it just naturally, we got more listeners as we got shorter. And there was more people that were interested in listening because it wasn't so long, and maybe you have a less of a drop off rate. I will admit that now I've started posting all my video as well, so I get to see more of the YouTube analytics, right. And you can see when people drop out, that as compared to, it's a little bit more difficult to see when they drop off a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, on Spotify, you can see that, right? And it's funny because my episodes from my own podcast, personal podcast, exactly, the true fans, they listen to the whole, like, 40 minutes, even when it's interview, like 1 hour. But it's on YouTube, it's a bit different. I also see that people that listen to me on Spotify, they tend to listen to the full episode. On YouTube, a lot of them just drop in the first, even like 5 minutes or so. So it's funny. Do you have any kind of hypothesis on why the retention might be different on Spotify versus YouTube?
Yeah, I think maybe people discover you better or easier on YouTube, so that they happen upon the show, and if it's interesting, like, that's a really good point, because you need to hook that person, especially that new listener, within that first 5 minutes. And I would argue it's probably within the first 60 seconds that you need to hook them. And I think TikTok says you need to hook them in the first 9 seconds or something. But you need to make sure, like I try to lead my episodes with a reason why they should keep listening. You know, especially on Talk Commerce, I try to make a small hook to say, hey, we're going to talk about this. You should listen to the whole episode.
Yeah.
That's important to because you will lose listeners if they think the topic is
Right.
if is not relevant.
Tell us about your show. Tell us about your podcast. What is it about, and for what kind of people are you talking to?
Yeah, like I mentioned in the beginning, I focused the show too much on e-commerce platforms and not about the experience in e-commerce. So
What is
now
the name also?
It's called Talk Commerce.
Talk Commerce. Okay.
Yeah. Now I focus on more of the solution and the journey that people would go through. So in terms of entrepreneurs or startups, what was their journey to get to the point in which they started doing e-commerce, right? I think that's way more, people are much more interested in the customer or the merchant story. And I learned this early on with a customer that had the bulk candy store. And he was on BigCommerce, and we were talking about BigCommerce. And as soon as I switched to more about his business and about how his business is running, the dynamics of the entire podcast completely changed. We're not talking about a boring platform. We're not talking about technology. We're talking about how their candy is freeze dried and how they take Skittles and freeze dry it and package it and sell it, and the fun bits about their story, not about the boring. Yeah, I migrated my 475 SKUs to BigCommerce and blah, blah, blah. It was really great. I had such a great time re-indexing my catalog. There was nothing exciting in that.
So much more unique content, more personalized as well, where you can actually kind of understand the background of the guest, right?
Yeah, I think that learning their story is more valuable than learning the technology behind the story. I think some people are very interested in the technology, but more people are interested in the practical application of what that is and how you did it.
And tell us about your story. I'm curious to know, why did you start this podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a e-commerce business, an agency where we sold Magento and then other platforms. And then my business partner and I sold our business in 2021. And I transitioned from being an entrepreneur to being an employee. And I discovered that that there is an opportunity for an employer who doesn't understand the mindset of an entrepreneur, that they suck every ounce of creative energy out of you. They take your spirit and leave you hollow. And so, in an attempt to retain some creative energy, I started a podcast, and it was completely on my own. I did it on nights and weekends or whatever. And in the same regard, it helped me to keep up and learn about what's happening in my space. So interviewing people like you helped me to learn and keep up with what's happening in technology, especially around whatever I'm interested in.
Yeah, it makes a little sense. So I know myself, being an entrepreneur, that it's so hard to work for others, right? We always want to create stuff. And having a podcast is a great way to kind of exercise this creativity that we all love to practice. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I guess that's working for you, right? Because your show has grown. We're just talking that you have around an audience of like 700 people, which is quite substantial. I'm curious, and we were talking a little bit about this before. So I know that you have guests, and you told me that you have now many requests, right? So at least one request to be a guest per day, which is crazy. How do you decide which guests you can actually take, or you should take, and which ones you have to say no to?
Yeah, so I'll be completely transparent, and for our listeners, I am a white, bald male, and I learned early that as soon as and we should say too, it's not just 700 people. Let's put it in a frame of a month, because that's the way advertisers like to see it. How many downloads you get a month? Let's just say I get 2,000 downloads a month, and that's on about 4 shows. There's probably people that listen every single episode, but there's always new people that come in and listen, and it is growing. So it's not just flat. Let's not, maybe last year I was half that.
Wow.
So in diversity, I learned that only that the people like me, other white males, are the ones that are always asking to be on your show. So the first thing I learned is I had 6 months of just having white males on my show. So I wanted to be I wanted to be more diverse, and I wanted to be cognitive, and I wanted to know and react to that in a way that helped me understand, hey, I should have more women on the show. I should have more people of color. I should have more people of regions, like different parts of the world. So I started, number one, it's great to have so many people coming to you to be on your show that you cannot say yes to everybody. But number two, then you have to start selecting who you're going to be on the show. So then I would select somebody that would be a good story. Well, I think is the number one thing, no matter what color they are, or what the sex there is,
gender and everything.
If they have a great story, I think it's always good to have them on the show. And then the second thing is that I would purposely not just accept every single white male, and I will probably get some pushback saying, well, that you shouldn't just you should just have everybody on the show. But I can't have everybody on the show. I have to be selective, and I have to give voices to other people. And if you're not listening and thinking about what that voice is, you're going to end up with the same. You're going to end up with the same type of guest every single time. There's not going to be a diversity in your guests, and I firmly believe that it's important to have diversity in who your guest is, because let's face it, the world is diverse, right? The world isn't all like me. The world isn't all like you.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. And it's hard though. Like myself having a podcast around entrepreneurship, it's hard to go away of our bubble, right? I'm also mostly interviewing men, mostly around my age. It's funny how even without noticing, we tend to attract, because we like, which might be a mistake, but we tend to be biased towards someone that kind of looks like us and thinks like us. So we also listen to episodes from people that, have similar perspectives. So we tend also to attract these people to be in our podcast, right? So once we start bringing people that are more diverse, hopefully we'll get also people that are more diverse listening to us. The question is, how do you attract people that are more diverse? Okay, one way that you just said is saying no to certain people and kind of cherry pick the person that you want as your guest. Is there other ways to attract people that are a little bit more diverse, with different perspectives, with different genders, skin colors, whatever, to be your guest?
Yeah, I think there's this idea of inbound, like you're just taking, the guests, the podcast guest services that are pitching all their clients. There's that, but then you have to be proactive in going and inviting people to be on your show as well. So, in the same regard that I will reach out to people that I think will be a great guest, and I'm purposeful in that. I'm intentful in making sure that I'm diverse in who I'm asking. So, I probably ask 1 out of 10 for my guests. Maybe I reach out to one person out of every 10 people that come to me, which is a great position to be in. But it's also sometimes it's difficult because you'd like to do every story. And I think in our green room, we did talk about, I started another podcast specifically about entrepreneurship.
Right.
So I could have a place to tell those stories that were specifically around being an entrepreneur and what that means.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that you said that there were so many people that maybe wouldn't necessarily qualify for one show, for the e-commerce show, but they could qualify to and that's why you started another show. And now what happens? So they send you a message and you say like, okay, not for this one, but I have this other show where maybe I could put you in. Is that it?
Yeah, and I guess I'm in a group called Entrepreneurs Organization. They have it in Brazil. There's about 17,000 members worldwide. So I have a ready-made audience. We have a chapter here in Minnesota that I'm part of. So it's a two-folded piece. I help to attract members for Entrepreneurs Organization, and at the same time I tell stories. And we tell stories around what it means to be an entrepreneur, but we also tell stories about not only what does it mean to be part of that, but we also bring in the entrepreneur operating system, EOS, which is very popular worldwide now. So there's some buzzwords that we specifically talk about that an entrepreneur might really resonate with. And those words are not just for entrepreneurs organization. They'd be for any entrepreneur anywhere in the world. Everybody has a problem with employees. We have problems with technology. We have all the same problems as an entrepreneur that every other entrepreneur has. That's not to say that you have a unique problem that I don't have, but there are experiences that we've both gone through that we can both relate with. And EO, Entrepreneurs Organization, is great at helping us just share our own experience, and hopefully you as another entrepreneur would relate to that experience and get something out of it.
Yeah. Before, we were also talking about something that is really interesting for a lot of podcasters, which is monetization. Granted, I know that you are still kind of playing around with it, but you just told me that your podcast breaks even, which a lot of people cannot say that, right? So you already have some sponsors. And yeah, I would like to discuss that a little bit, but I guess starting with the funny story that you were telling me on how a conversation about crickets, the bug, the insect, turned out to be a great article that is now attracting, thousands of people. What can you tell us that story?
So I have a friend, Kalen Jordan. He has a podcast as well. Excuse me, and we will do one together periodically. And as a joke, we were just doing some banter back and forth, and he said, "Wouldn't it be great if we had a cricket protein sponsor, and that we would, that they would help us do this?" I don't know where crickets came up, but we were just talking about having a sponsor for cricket protein powder. So this is pre-ChatGPT. This is in 2021 at some point. I wrote an article using one of those AI tools that are out there about crickets, right? And about cricket protein bars and protein powder, or whatever it was. And I noticed in my Google Search Console and Google Analytics that I was getting a lot of traffic on this one particular article. I mean, I didn't even write it as a blog post. I just wrote it as a landing page on my WordPress site. I noticed it was getting a lot of traction. I got really curious about the data behind that. And I did start another business this year, or the last year, I should say, in March, called Content Basis, where we write content based on your data that's coming in through analytics. So this is sort of a twofolded thing. It's an experiment in showing people that if you are writing about the same content over and over again, you are going to get success in that content, right? It is about the long haul. It's about the marathon. It's not about the short sprint and maybe, paid ads get you that quick content. So I wrote this thing, and then I noticed that I'm getting a lot of traction on crickets. So I started writing more content about crickets. I didn't do it right away. It took me a little bit of time, but I realized, hey, what would happen if I wrote more about this subject? So I would dig deep into my Google Search Console. I would find out what are things that what impressions am I getting that people aren't clicking, but maybe on page 100 of Google. So I started writing about those topics and bringing it up. Then I wrote a really long piece about what are the top 10 cricket protein companies in America. Wow, that even got more. That got more traction. So then I got interested. Well, maybe I should actually reach out to some of these people to say, hey, I'm getting all this traffic. For example, in November of 2023, I had an all-time high of 20 or 25,000 clicks, just clicks, not just views, but clicks on my protein or my cricket article that I wrote. So there's some substantial traffic that's coming for crickets. Nobody's interested. So I put the plea out there for crickets. That if you are a cricket manufacturer or a farmer, or you're making something I've reached out to Exo Protein many times, and they're big in the cricket business. They have no interest in any of this. So then I decided I'm going to do Google AdSense, which is super annoying, but it's a way for me to at least pay for the traffic that's coming in on my website.
And is it already generating money, the Google AdSense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that pays for my hosting, and it pays,
Wow. Crazy.
For sure.
Wow, that's really cool. So again, it shows the power of SEO, right? Which is something that a lot of people kind of ignore, but it's really, really powerful. And What is interesting is, can we use this as a way to also bring new listeners, right? So, and that goes to the whole repurposing thing of episodes, right? So let's say your episode is about e-commerce, not necessarily about crickets, but maybe there's some podcasters that have podcasts around this kind of cricket protein, and they can repurpose. So I guess based on what you just said, repurposing an episode into a blog can then get a lot of clicks on Google, that necessarily people will be like, oh, cool, they also have a podcast, let me listen to that. So doing kind of the bridge for Pod Squeeze, how do you use Pod Squeeze in your flow? And can that be also a way to repurpose content so that you can get SEO traffic?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll upload our episode into PodSqueeze, and it'll give me back my summary. It'll give me back a full blog post, which is fantastic. It'll also give me tweets and LinkedIn posts. It'll give me all kinds of great data that I can use for repurposing. And I think repurposing is the thing that most podcasters, including myself, miss out on, right? It is, if you put it into a workflow that makes sense, that's easy, and you do it consistently, or even hire a company, like I think you could use PodSqueeze, and in less than an hour, you'd have your whole thing done, right? I'm using Riverside now, so like I can actually I can send my finished podcast. I can finish the editing right inside of Riverside, and I can send it directly to Transistor. I can now add a front and back to it directly in there. I can add multiple tracks to the front and back of my podcast. So where in the past I've had to download the actual episode and try to edit it somewhere else, I don't even have to do that anymore. So there are a lot of great tools, and there's a lot of things that people can do to really organize their workflow. And if they use something like PodSqueeze to make sure that content is then in there, and they can start using it in different places, that's going to be fantastically important to everything they do. And that, again, because of my personal bandwidth, I do this on my own. I don't have anybody that works for me in terms of getting the podcast done. I have a business partner in my new business, but they're focused on actually paying customers, and I'm not a paying customer. I'm just Talk Commerce is a customer that doesn't pay anything. We're doing this out of the love of our heart. So
I think that's also the beauty of these new AI tools and any kind of tools around podcasting, that it gives us back time, and with the time that we used to invest, so we just invest the same time as before, but we can output much more, right? Editing is easier, repurposing is easier, making videos is easier, finding guests. So I think it's all about really using these tools that the market is offering to take the most out of our shows, our podcasts, and find and kind of also follow these little leads, which is really interesting. I always like, okay, let's find. You just followed the cricket, area because of a chat you had, and now you know more. Now you have kind of a business around content and writing content just because of that, just because of crickets, right? So that's also something that I really enjoy. Sometimes just following our creativity can lead us to a place that we didn't even know existed. So yeah, Brent, thank you so much for coming to the show. It was really interesting to hear your story. Tell us again, where can we find you? What's the name of your podcast and your socials?
Sure. You can find me on most of the social channels at Brent W. Peterson. So on LinkedIn, I'm at Brent W. Peterson. On YouTube, I think I'm Brent W. Peterson. On Twitter, I'm Brent W. Peterson. I have a very, very large LinkedIn following. So I encourage you to follow me there. My podcast is called Talk Commerce, talk-commerce.com. And you can find it on all the different places where podcasts are produced or are distributed. I would encourage you to find me on Apple or Spotify or wherever you're looking for those places. And if you want to contact me, it's Brent, Brent, at talk-commerce.com.
Perfect. I will also link everything in the show notes of this episode. Brent, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by PodSqueeze, an essential tool for podcasters that creates show notes, timestamps, clips, and more. Visit podsqueeze.com and use the code PODCASTER for 20% discount in the first 3 months. We release a new episode every Tuesday and Thursday. See you in the next episode of Lessons from a Podcaster.